We are live. Welcome, everyone. Now that we've started, we're going to take 5 minutes to just set everything up, give you an explanation of what's going to happen. Then we're going to have a little discussion between David and Jacob talking about the Eno scores. What we really want to do today is to discuss and help you understand and unpack how to use your Eno scores to best help your work, help your productivity. What does every Eno score mean? How you can leverage that, how you can see that over time, and how you can use that over time, use your Eno phone over time to better explain it. To better support you. So without further ado, thank you for joining this webinar. We're going to be understanding how you can understand your brain through the Eno app, which means that we're going to be going into the Eno scores of mental effort, readiness, and efficiency to understand what that means for your mental fitness, because Eno phone really is a mental fitness tracker. That means we're bettering how you work and how you understand your deep work sessions with your Eno phone. That means how many sessions are good to help you achieve your goals, and how to look at those sessions with more understanding so that you can keep leveling up your mental fitness. Here we have David and Jacob to answer certain questions, and I want to start with a little explanation about what are the metrics, what are the Eno scores, and how did you decide on these Eno scores? And I'm going to direct that question to Jacob. Please expand.
So, hey everybody, I'm Jacob. I'm one of the co-founders and I'm the CEO of Eno. Just to reiterate what Alina was saying, if you have questions for us, top right corner of your screen, you can click the chat, put your comments, your questions, and any feedback on there. We're iterating on this webinar format as we kind of go through it, so we want to figure out what you like, what you dislike, and what you want to hear from us. So today, mental fitness scores, and the question was, what are the mental fitness scores? For those of you who have updated the Eno app recently, you'll notice that we now have a new dashboard with 3 mental fitness scores: mental effort, readiness, and efficiency. And those are new. We've been working on those for the last 12 months, really trying to isolate useful information from the sensors that you get in your Eno phones that can help guide you through how to make decisions about your productivity and your mental health. So I'm going to tell you a little story about kind of how we came up with those. Prior to this new rebranding, we're all about focus. And we've always talked about focus. It's always what we've been trying to encourage, is using the Eno phones to get into a deep state of focus. But there's a funny thing about focus, which is that if you look in the literature, researchers don't use the word focus to describe neural states. So when we were looking for trying to measure focus using EEG, we had to find different words that these researchers were using to describe what we ultimately feel as a state of focus. And so we started with neuroscience, and when you look into the neuroscience, they tend to talk not about focus, but about attention. And attention is a very specific phenomena of orienting your gaze and your processing towards one element. So for example, paying attention to your screen, there's a noise in the corner, you'd orient your attention towards that, and then you can orient it back to the screen. That's one part of what we feel when we say focus, but when you say I've been focusing for the last half hour, you don't mean I've been paying attention every single second. You mean generally, this is what's been taking most of my cognitive power. And so when we looked into the neuroscience literature, attention happens on the millisecond time frame, whereas focus, when we describe it colloquially, is more of a minute-by-minute thing. And so we moved away from neuroscience towards more of the psychology literature, which had terms like engagement and mind-wandering and motivation. And these were really, really characteristic of what we mean when we say focus, right? To say I'm engaged in my work, or I'm motivated towards my work, or I'm wandering away from my work, it feels like the right characteristic. It feels like you're describing a state of focus. The issue with the psychology literature is that they focus on the behavioral characteristics of them, not the underlying mechanisms of them. And so often a lot of these words like cognitive engagement and mind wandering were very difficult to isolate from the rest of what we mean when we say focus. Basically, it's hard to sit somebody down and have them do a task that has specific levels of engagement such that you can train your models to recognize those neural states. And often those neural states in EEG are not even defined at all. And so where we ended up landing was that if you look at psychrometric testing, this is a field where they sit people down and they try to measure different levels of different neural states. There are 2 phenomena in your brain that are very, very well understood. that are quantifiable with specific experiments and that generally mean what we feel when we're describing a state of focus. And those were cognitive workload and cognitive fatigue. And so that's what actually ended up being the foundation for what we now call mental effort, readiness, and efficiency. It's this idea of, can we measure your brain's level of cognitive workload and cognitive fatigue, and then transform those into metrics that have more colloquial meaning, such that when you see your mental effort score, you can understand what's going on and extract meaning from it.
Great. Thank you. So this brings us to, now that we've understood that focus is not just a focus score, we have to understand it through these psychological parameters. I'd love, David, if you could explain to us how you measure that. So how do we go from our raw EEG data from the Eno Phone sensors into these three scores?
Absolutely. So I think it's the first time I joined, so I'm just gonna give a little bit of context for who I am. So I am the other founder and CTO of Eno, so I'm mostly in charge of the product. So it's a great question. I love to talk about this stuff. So essentially, I think the core idea behind how we determine those metrics is through the design of experiments. By experiments, what I mean is we design a game that will go and simulate certain parameters in the brain or certain behaviors. So, for example, in the latest experiment for mental effort, what we've done is we've created a game that is an end back game. An end back game is going to be an experiment where you're being shown cards on the screen and you need to click a button whenever a card would be matching certain kind of criteria. For example, you see a card on the screen, and every time you see that card pass again, you would click a button. Or maybe you see a certain shape on the screen, and you need to press a button every time two shapes before was the same shape. Anyways, there's a few kind of level of difficulty, and the purpose of the game is to play something while recording data that will modulate the amount of mental effort that is required to play the game. So that's the first part of it. So we play a game while wearing the headset, and we create game conditions that will require more or less mental effort. So now we have a baseline for how your mental effort should change while you play the game. The next step then is to take the EEG data, try to break it down into what we call feature, which is parameters of the data, and see which parameters will change with respect to that mental effort that we've kind of manipulated inside the game. And really, we develop these models that will predict mental effort based on like the result of the game and what we saw in the data while you were playing the game. And so that is what makes it into the final product as the metric. That was an example specifically for mental effort.
What's cool about that is because of the nature of Eno Phone, we can have dozens of people doing these experiments in different conditions, different parts of the world, different environments, and you get a much more generalizable sample of how your brains will change as a function of this activity. And so it's something that in the future we're going to be really looking forward to, is giving you guys access to some of these experiments so that you can run them yourselves and see how your brain changes, and then personalize the feedback that we're giving to you.
Yeah, and on this topic, if there's anybody listening in and has already started, I know a lot of us have talked about the different kinds of experiments you can do with your mental fitness, whether it's your sleep routine or the way you organize your tasks or what kind of comments you put into your Eno sessions. There's like a section where once you start a session, you can put a comment of what kind of task you were doing. If you're doing anything like that, please do share with us in the chat box and in the channels in general, because we're all trying new things. We all want to do our best, and that way we can learn together. So, David, you gave us an example of mental effort, right? And Jacob, I want to know if you can expand a little bit on what does each one mean? What does mental effort mean? What does readiness mean? What does efficiency mean? And how do they play together? We can go into that a little bit more with David after.
Yeah, our goal for Eno Phone was always to make this information as clear and actionable as possible. It's something that we've noticed in neuroscience literature, is that a lot of the neural states are very, very narrowly defined and therefore hard to generalize across your life. You get data, you don't know what to do with it. And I hate that when you have a wearable. And so our goal was to make this as clear and simple as possible. So the 3 metrics we've got, the first one, mental effort. In essence, it's how hard your brain's working. So a high cognitive demand task that you're deeply focused on, that you're working for long periods of time, that really takes a lot of processing power, that's going to be really high mental effort. Whereas a task where you're kind of leaning back, you are scanning instead of calculating information, maybe you're moving things around but you're not actually computing it, or when you're low motivation, that will show up as low mental effort. As you can often see during a given session, when you will start the session, you'll do a high mental effort task, and then you'll switch to a distraction and your mental effort will drop. What we also have noticed recently is that the patterns of how mental effort changes over time are also characteristic of the type of work you're doing. So oscillations in mental effort, where it's going from very high to very low and kind of jumping back and forth, tends to be indicative of context switching, where you're calculating something and then you're changing information. When you change those topics, there are often periods of low effort between them, and that's what causes some of that oscillation. Whereas when you are deeply embedded in a task, highly, highly focused, and reaching kind of like a flow state, that will usually maintain your mental effort very consistently over 5 to 10 to 15 minute periods. And so what you want to be looking for in your mental effort score is 2 things. How high or low is it, which is indicative of how difficult the task is and how hard your brain's working. And then how much oscillation is there, which is indicative of how much context switching there is versus a steady flow state. That's number 1. Number 2 is readiness. Readiness is kind of a flip. That's that cognitive fatigue element. Cognitive fatigue means that you're going to require a higher effort to accomplish the same level of computation than if your fatigue was lower. And so fatigue, and the readiness score in particular, will start at 1 every session. And what you're going to be looking for is sharp drops in fatigue. As your readiness is dropping, it's indicative of you doing something that is causing high levels of stress or decreasing your motivation or activating your mental effort in a way that is tiring. Sharp drops in readiness are indicative of fatiguing events during your sessions. And then the other thing with readiness that you want to keep track of is, where does that score end up at the end of your session? So when it starts to drop below 80, we recommend that after that session, you should take a small break, because below 80, you're going to start to have decreases in your ability to focus for long periods of time on your work. Below 50 is when you're starting to have very highly taxing sessions that could be indicative of stress or of burnout or of lack of motivation. And so you're probably going to want a larger break between sessions that have a low readiness score below 50. That's number 2. Number 3 is your efficiency, which has to do with how focused you are. And the converse of it, how distracted you're becoming. And so what you'll often notice during your sessions is you'll start working and you'll have a high efficiency, and then you'll get distracted by an app like an email client or Teams or Slack or some other distraction that isn't the core of your work, and your efficiency will drop. Small drops of efficiency that are very, very short are indicative of a quick distraction that you came back from. And so what I like to do is look for those periods and then see what my mental effort and readiness did at the same time. The opposite of that is when you have a sustained period of low efficiency, and that generally is indicative of multitasking behavior, where you're jumping between 3 different apps that are not fundamentally related to each other, that you don't tend to use at the same time historically. And so when you have that, you're going to notice typically higher levels of stress, higher levels of fatigue, and higher mental effort in order to keep up with the cognitive demands of all that task switching. So those 3 scores, mental effort, taxing how hard your brain's working, readiness, looking at how fatigue, and efficiency, looking at your level of distraction, they play together. And where you're going to get the most value out of your Eno Phone is finishing a session and then looking at how your 3 scores change throughout the session as a function of what you were doing.
Amazing, thank you. This brings us right into my next question for David, which is what's the best way to use the Eno phone to get the most out of your data? And the first things that come to mind, if the people listening also want to ask questions more specifically, but for example, what you just talked about, Jacob, about at what level should we be taking a break? After 50%, then you know you're in stress or you're no longer motivated. So what else can we do, David, to make the best use of our Eno phone and the most out of our data?
Great. So I think I discussed in one channel this yesterday a little bit, but I think it's good to keep a strategy in mind for how we should gather data and sort of start getting insights from it. Because of course, what we're trying to get out of this is some kind of conclusion, actionable insight that would allow us to do things better, to use our brain more efficiently or at the right time. And so the core idea is, you know, what strategy do we want to follow? My suggestion when we begin is to have a sort of exploration phase. So what you will want to do is when you get the device first and you start using it while you work, is just to focus on doing as much deep work as you can. So what is deep work? Deep work is working only on a single task. Try to set a goal, work on that single task, try not to get distracted by other things, and then that's it, right? Try to do work the way you would, but by keeping as focused as you can. You can do this different times of the day. You can do sessions of different lengths. The idea is to do as much as you can at the beginning so that you can start gathering the data. Then, once you start having some sessions logged in, you can go to the stats page and start noticing the different trends and insight that you see. One specific example would be time of the day. So if you've done sessions in the morning, around noon, in the afternoon, if you have enough data, you'll start seeing patterns where, for example, if you take best time of the day, you'll see patterns in mental effort where naturally your mental effort is higher during certain periods of the day and lower in others. And so once you start getting that insight, you can start to focus and really explore areas in your day that are probably naturally better for you. For example, for me, I tend to have lower mental effort on average in the mornings or around noon or dinner. So what I know from me from gathering a lot of data is that around 3 p.m. I tend to do really well. So now I start to do most of my session during that time, and I'm kind of narrowing down every month the best moment for me to be doing this work. And then I have another second period, which is at 8 p.m., funnily enough. And so I do some work or studying at night as well around that time. And so really you want to go from exploring and doing sessions throughout the day to narrowing it down to where it matters for you. And then this is generally my number one strategy for gathering data and figuring out these insights.
Great, thank you. This kind of goes into one of our first questions, and actually one that I wanted to ask as well, which is, are there individual high points? So for example, and we asked for a bit more expansion on it, but to start off, for example, when Jacob said, oh, at 80%, then we should take a break. At below 50%, you're probably really stressed out and it can indicate too much mental fatigue. So are there standard levels or percentages that we should, look out for? Or as Dan said, are we all chasing 100%? But or is it more a self-analysis? So to start with your Eno phone and then try it out a few times, see where your averages is. Is there generalized goals that we should look for, or is it really that subjective or personal?
This was a this was an interesting one because it's as a fundamental assumption you have to take whenever you're using neurotech devices is that everyone's brain is very different. And so when you are looking at your own data and you're looking at someone else's, comparing side by side, you'll often have very different results for what should have been the same activity. In our previous app, we didn't normalize that at all. And so we had some individuals, I remember one was an investment banker I was talking to, whose mental effort, which we were calling focus score at the time, was only ever at 20. It was always very, very, very low. And they were confused as to why, like, I don't think I'm bad at focusing. Why is my mental effort at 20? That's because of their baseline of the relative signals that are producing the mental effort score hover at a certain baseline, and our algorithms are watching the oscillations around that baseline. So it's important to note things are going to be very specific for you, and you need to be looking at how your data reflects what you know to be true about what works and what doesn't work for your productivity. This data is meant to complement, not replace your own judgment about what works well for you. When we're talking about mental effort specifically, what we found to be the case is two things. Number one is consistency matters a lot. When you have sessions that are, let's say, starting at 75, that rise to 85, and then that stay at 85 that whole session, very, very often when you ask someone at the end of that session, how was that for you? Like, did you feel productive? Were you in a flow state? They reply, this was one of my best sessions ever. And so look for consistency in your data. That will often be the best indicator of whether you were deeply focused on your work or whether your mind was working very hard, lots of mental effort, but it was switching between a bunch of tasks and it may not have been most productive. And then the second thing is, on average, sessions that are lower mental effort and sessions that are higher mental effort, people will report that they felt more focused, they felt like they got more done on higher mental effort sessions. And so you're going to want to look at the overall session score. It takes a lot more data into account and therefore is more indicative than any given individual minute of that session. And so I don't think that you have to be chasing 100%. What you want to be using the scores is together, looking at how the mental effort and the readiness and the efficiency tell the same story about what you know to be true, which is, was my session deeply productive, focused on a single task, or was I bouncing around between different tasks, not getting as much done as I could?
If I was going to add something interesting to this, is there is something about the oscillations that, like you said, is very important to look at because it's indicative of context switching. The other thing is if you see you do the same task and at the beginning you have a certain mental effort and it progressively starts going down, you know you're doing the same thing, but it kind of slowly starts going down, then that's indicative of basically fatigue in a sense. It is indicative that you're not using your cognitive resources as efficiently as you used to, and maybe the session is just too long. So negative trends are generally not a positive thing. So that's something to keep in mind.
I'm rereading, Dan, your question now, and one thing I want to mention is the data itself is normalized based on what we expect to see from your data in your brain. And so 100% for you won't be 100% for somebody else. Look to see what your data is manifesting and what your averages tend to be, and try to beat that average every day.
And I would also like to add, I remember there was a comment from our community a little bit ago as well about the readiness that they were seeing their readiness line just drop very quickly. What would that indicate? Is the readiness supposed to, slowly? Because for me, it does diminish, but much more in a much more stable line than the photo that she had shared on the Discord server. Can we talk a little bit about that?
With the readiness score, so as a caveat, we're actually working on a slight update to the readiness score that might more accurately reflect what I'm about to say. But so look for that in a future update. We don't have a timeline for it yet, but it'll be coming relatively soon. But with the readiness score, what you want to be looking for essentially is two things. The first is sharp drops and the slope of those drops, which is indicative of how fatigued the actions you were doing were making your brain. So if you are doing something that is very taxing emotionally, is very stressful, is very cognitively demanding in a way that cannot be sustained for long periods of time, you will notice that the rate of change of your readiness will be quite abrupt. Whereas often when you're doing low stress activities, even if they have a high mental effort, it will keep the readiness going at a much, much shallower angle for longer periods of time. And that's why readiness is a good indication of whether you need a break afterwards, whether you need time to kind of emotionally and cognitively recover from the session. The second thing you want to be looking for is where do you end up at the end of that session? And so if you have a sharp drop and it ends up at 0, that should be indicative of the fact that you probably want to break after that session. Whereas even if the drop is relatively sharp, if it flattens out and you end up with a session that only goes above 50, then you might be capable of doing more work of the same cognitive demand immediately afterwards.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to also mention for everybody listening that our Q&A has officially started for the last 5-ish plus minutes just before we end. So I welcome you all to drop your questions in the chat box. We have another one that kind of feeds into this. Should I be breaking up my sessions per kind of task I'm doing? This also relates to the context switching that we were talking about and that you expanded on, David. And I think this was about efficiency, but they also relate to the other scores, if I'm correct.
I've got some opinions on this. David, do you want to give your opinion, or shall I take it?
Sure, I can give mine and then you can give yours. I think it's good to have different perspectives on this
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, there is a lot of interpretation that needs to happen. And one of the things that is important is context. And you as the end user have a lot of context on what you're doing, what is good and what is bad. Data that you know is true that, let's say the app doesn't have access to. So it's important that you kind of make it work for you. So I tend to prefer to break up sessions generally because different tasks will require different sort of like baseline levels for maybe mental effort. So if you are, for example, doing, I don't know, you're doing some design or some problem solving, it's likely that your mental effort is going to be higher than if you simply do some kind of email answering or something like that. If you don't break up your session, then you might see it looking as you had a good session and then it drops and then the session is not as good anymore. But it really is a different context and a different type of task. And you wouldn't expect your metrics to necessarily be the same. So that's the first reason as I like to break it up into different things because then the context is different, and so you would expect you care a lot about the differences within the same context, less so about the different tasks. So that's one of the way I'm seeing it. And is there anything else on this one I'm thinking about? No, I think breaking it up like this, and when you enter a task, it just allows you to really know what you were doing at the time. So when you go back and look at your data, if you've been doing a lot of different things, then you lose the sort of context of like, what was I doing and what were the results? You just don't know anymore because you've been doing so many things. You can start looking at the apps you've used, but it gets complicated. I think it's easier to break it into sessions. So I don't know, Jacob, if you have the same strategy. That's tends to be how I operate.
So actually, I think I might be the opposite. And this was part of the reason I really like this question is that our philosophy for Eno was always, let's create a tool that gives you insight into what's happening so that we can start to kind of experiment and figure out what best to do with this, right? With this data that fundamentally is completely novel to most of us. I like for my sessions to reflect the way I think about the way I was spending my day. And so what I mean by that is that if I sit down, let's say I just had lunch, 2 p.m., and I sit down for work, and I spend 2 hours focused on deep work. And in that deep work, I have 3 different tasks that I end up accomplishing. I will often leave my Eno phones on and not pause my sessions between them so that I have a full reflection of that 2 hours of work. Because fundamentally, the way I was thinking about my day was that I was scheduling 2 hours of deep work, and then I was switching to emails or meetings or whatever it may be. And so I like for my sessions to reflect the way that I planned my work, because I think one of the big benefits of having Eno Phone is that you can see how your scheduling and the inputs and the planning that you made about where you were going to spend your time are reflected in the data telling you about how your brain was responding to those tasks. To contrast, if I start a session with some deep work and I'm doing a task and then one of our teammates pings me and says like, "Hey, we need to work on this thing right now," and I am now fundamentally task switching, then I will end my session, take off my Eno phones, even sometimes take a little break, and then start the next task because those are no longer related entities, and I don't want to have them interpreted as the same result. And so I think one of the big things to think about when you're using Eno Phone is how can I use the data that I'm getting to try and be more mindful and deliberate about the way that I am engaging in my own productivity, and use your reflection on the data as a mechanism for feeding back into the way that you think about planning and organizing and scheduling your own time and your own priorities.
Do you think there's something to be said about the idea of like it seems to me that the two approaches are different, but they also try to optimize different things. So I think you're trying to optimize a block of deep work, whereas you can also try to optimize individual tasks. And I think this is really how I view the difference is like if I break my day into different tasks and sessions for each task, then what I'm trying to do is optimize my time during a task and my resources during a task, whereas you try to optimize the block of time that you're using the Eno phone for. And I think that's the only difference.
Yeah.
Maybe correct me if I'm wrong. Do you feel like this agrees?
It absolutely does. Really, ultimately, Enophone will only tell you the story about the data reflective of how you were spending your time and where you were putting your attention. And so, if your priority is to learn about how different tasks are impacting your mental health, for example, then splitting each task into the really small bites to see how your readiness score in a finite amount of time is impacted by that task might be the best experiment you could run. Whereas if your goal is to see how your overall schedule during the day changes how your brain activity is interpreted, then you need to be doing experiments that change with the day. Ultimately, I think what the best thing about Enophone is that you can sit down and run experiments on your own habits and actually finally have data to put to that, right? Have numbers associated with what was ultimately otherwise just a feeling, a gut check.
Mm.
And so I think it's worth spending a lot of time thinking about it, and I definitely reflect on it very often. Is how can I organize my time and my day and my priorities in such a way that I'm learning from it and getting a feedback loop that I can then reflect on and iterate on in the future, rather than just assuming that what I'm doing is fine and never reflecting on it and therefore never improving.
Yeah, and I think it's worth acknowledging that it depends with what kind of work you do on the regular. Are you,
Hmm.
do you go through a task list? Is it, over if you're working in community management or with customer service, it's like it's a whole lot of time of just like one thing. And so maybe you just want to cut that to 1 hour or 2 hours and just make sure that you're doing that for that amount of time. But it's kind of like an endless thing versus task-oriented work. Um, we
Yeah, 100%.
have,
Percent. When you have different types of work, like in a given week, sometimes I'll have entire days where I'm just jumping back and forth between 20-minute
Hmm.
segments on different stuff to contrast like big long days worth of deep work. Tags are a good thing for that one, where you can start tagging
yeah,
different sessions to say, okay, this is this kind of work versus this kind of work. And then when you go in the stats page, you can filter by tag to see how that changes the data.
Yeah.
exactly. And so,
It might be in. Sorry, go ahead.
no, no, you can.
Okay, I was gonna say maybe the one solution to this in the future would be able to, break up a longer session into task or flag when you're task switching or wanting to task switch so that you get to see the overall, but maybe also a view of like within that task, kind of what happened. Because it really is the only difference that I'm seeing. Um, and yeah, that could be an interesting thing
Yeah, and this
because
is
tags are general.
this is why I recommend everybody listening to experiment with your Enophone and see your day. Like there are so many goals that you have for your day, your week, your month, your year, and then you don't really know how close you're getting to them until you know how you're working and optimizing your time. So definitely do experiment with them, put in the hours and see how you're working, see how that is being reflected with your scores. We are a few minutes, a few minutes beyond the set 30 minutes of this webinar. So I welcome you to drop any last questions. We'll try to answer them either here or later on. But okay, we have one more. We're going to finish up with one more. It's a multi-part question from Nantam, so thank you. This is a question about Bluetooth.
This might be better.
This might be.
I think this one's going to require a little bit of research. I've scanned through it, and I don't know that it's answerable immediately. I think we're going to have to look into it.
Yeah, this doesn't fit in the scope, and we're gonna have to look at this question. But thank you for your question. I'm gonna save it, and I'm gonna answer you myself through Discord. You can also send me an email at hello@inophone.com. But before we end, is there any last comments, Jacob and David, that you would like to share with our community today?
The big thing that I'm focusing on that has nothing to do with this webinar, that is completely independent, is we've now shipped all of our pre-order Eno phones, which was a huge milestone for us. And so we're starting to spend more time thinking about finding new users who are interested in Eno phone. And you'll notice on social media, we've started running ads, and that we are going to be giving review units to reviewers to get articles written about us, and kind of just spreading the word about Eno and telling the world, what we've been working on for 6 years. And so it's a quick ask. If you see posts that we make, or you see articles on social media, if you have friends who may be interested in this, help us spread the word. The more people that we get using Eno phone, the better the experience for all of us as a community, and the better we'll be able to continue building out these new features that add a lot of value in the app.
Yeah, to extend on this, you talked about sharing externally. Also, like, if you do use the application, you use it for multiple hours every week, do provide us some feedback, because we do our best to interview people to try to understand where things can get improved, what are the the most important problems or questions that people have, and we're always trying to improve that experience. So do share what you're facing or what you would want to see in the app. We just had someone that asked, can we filter by tag? Yes, we can, in an upcoming update that will come soon. But these are all things that we can do to improve the app. But we just need to know more about how you use it, what value you get, and what you wish we had. These kind of things are quite important for us.
Yes, and just like David just alluded to, if you do have feedback, we do host community connect calls, and I would love to hear from you. You can take a slot in my calendar, and we can have a conversation. You can tell us all about your experience, things that would help make your experience better, help us get to know you. And like Jacob said, the more you tell us, the better we get, and the more we can share with new users. So whether you're referring us or you see our posts on social media or Google, please do participate and tell us what your experience has been. And thank you to everyone for being here. It's been great. We're still iterating, like we mentioned. We still iterating on this webinar structure. We used to have backer updates, and now we're going to be having bi-weekly or a monthly webinars. So also you can go onto the community server of Eno Phone, into the Eno community channel, and tell us what kind of webinars you want us to host, what kind of topics would be interesting to you, and we would love to make that happen. Thank you so much.
The more feedback, the better. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.